Good morning, everyone. I'm Nez Aquino, Chief Operating Officer at the Global Risk Institute. On behalf of GRI, I am pleased to welcome you to the fourth event in our 2025 Macroeconomic Policy webinar series. In the first three webinars of this year, we examined the Bank of Canada policy, talking about the interest rate outlook, the supply and demand side of the housing outlook for Canada, and the fiscal policy, talking about the relatively limited tools available to the Canadian government in navigating these interesting times. In case you missed these sessions, they're available on our website. Today's event is Navigating Uncharted Waters, Rethinking Canada's Economic Strategy Amid Trade Shocks and the America First Policy Reset. Our session today will be moderated by Jason Stewart, Executive in Residence at GRI, and features Christopher Sands, Director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. I'm joining this event from GRI's offices in Toronto, situated on the traditional territory of many nations, covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Now, much has been said over the last month about the potential impact of the ongoing and far-reaching U.S. policy reset for Canada. In the last session of the macroeconomic policy series, we explored with Professor Trevor Toome from University of Calgary the impact of U.S. tariffs, predicting that a broad-based 25% tariff on Canadian imports would likely reduce Canada's GDP somewhere between 2 to 2.5%, and therefore putting this country into a recession. And just last week, we heard from the Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem that if the tariffs are broad-based and long-lasting, there won't be a bounce back for the Canadian economy in the near future. And naturally, as a result, measured and surveyed uncertainty indices in the country have risen over the last month. Today's session aims to go further than tariffs and the counter-tariffs conversation by exploring the larger implications of the U.S. policy reset, including impacts on defense spend, taxation, and regulation. We will examine Canada's challenges and opportunities arising from the Trump administration's America First policies overall, the end to the global rules-based order led by the U.S. that we've been accustomed to since World War II, and a somewhat wavering U.S. commitment to defending Europe and other structural changes in the new global environment. Before I turn the session over to Jason and Christopher, just a couple of reminders. We are recording the session today, and it will be shared on our website later. We've allocated some time for questions at the end of the moderated period. Please submit your questions through the chat channel to all panelists, and we'll address as many as we can. And finally, when you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a very short survey. Your feedback informs the quality and the content of our future events, so please take a moment to fill out the survey. With that, Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Nez, and good morning. Canada-U.S. relations, along with Central Canada-Western Canada relations and the French-English challenge, are the three great political axes that decisively shaped Canada well before its creation and continue to crucially influence its path today. The complex and evolving history of Canada-U.S. relations includes over 2 centuries, with periods of moves towards much greater integration and also shifts to times of sharp divergence. Since World War II, we've seen strong economic ties fostered by the Auto Pact, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and NAFTA. Pressure to reduce integration followed the tariff and other economic policy shocks of the Nixon administration in 1971 and the Trump administration trade threats and America First policies today. Understanding U.S. threats, risks, and opportunities in 2025 and beyond for Canada begins with analyzing these as part of the sea change in America's international policy and domestic politics. This broader global and U.S. domestic context helps inform and hopefully achieve better Canadian policy approaches to retaliation, adaptation, and diversification. Key questions include how and when to retaliate against actual U.S. tariffs or ongoing tariff threats, how to ensure Canada's countermeasures are carefully designed and well calibrated, and also offer an alternative path where both the U.S. and Canada benefit, and how to frame and undertake adaptation and diversification in meaningful ways that also limit the unintended consequences. Given the breadth and depth of these challenges, we are fortunate today to have Chris Sands as our featured presenter. Chris's expertise in U.S. domestic politics, foreign policy, and Canadian politics and economics offers a unique perspective on Canada-U.S. relations. Chris's extensive credentials include being the director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute and of the Hopkins Center for Canadian Studies. He is a sought-after commentator and analyst by U.S. and Canadian media. His approach is distinguished by weaving global, Canada-U.S., and domestic U.S. and Canadian factors in a clear and incisive manner. It is no surprise that his book, Canada-United States, Differences That Count, is in its 5th edition. And with that, Chris, please begin.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks to Nez also for having me here. I really appreciate being invited and having a chance to talk to the Global Risk Institute. It's a distinguished group. I heard from several people who signed up for this webinar in advance, so hello to you all. Really glad to have you here. So you have my opening slide. You know the title, so I'm just going to get right down into the discussion. So to situate where we are in Washington, I wanted to start by flagging, for those of you who have a voracious reading habit, this book by Christopher Little, Year Zero, the 5-year presidency. And I had a chance to present with Mr. Little at the sort of lead in to the 2020 election, as we were talking about how one might prepare. And it's worth reading if you can find the book, because it goes back, this edition anyway, goes back and talks about how you need to prepare 12 months in advance of taking office in order to have the most successful 4 years after. And if you look at this book, you'll see sort of the Trump playbook as we've seen it in the last 30 days and more. This, unlike the first Trump administration, it is clear that this time President Trump hit the ground running, was much better prepared for the challenge of governing Washington. It started with the famous days of thunder, executive orders, nominations, and flooding the zone with quite a lot of different activities. So if people didn't like what he was doing on health or didn't like what he was doing on defense, it was almost impossible for Democrats in Congress, out in the rest of the country, to organize to push back, because there was just so much happening every day. Often we go to sleep here in Washington and discover that while we were sleeping, there have been another couple of executive orders that were timed to come out in the middle of the night. Now, I believe that the president uses these, his more outrageous proposals as part of shifting something called the Overton window, which some of you will be familiar with. It's the sort of range, if you will. The window is the range of acceptable ideas. And by taking something quite dramatic as a position, the Overton window shifts so that a more moderate or sensible policy that is still quite consistent with President Trump's conservative vision and more populist vision becomes almost mainstream, or it looks relatively less shocking. So, for example, we saw proposals to buy Greenland, turn Canada into the 51st state, turn Gaza into the new Gaza Riviera, all of which bold proposals grab people's attention, even taking over the Panama Canal. I'm not sure that any of them are really proposals that we should take seriously, but they do give an indication of how he's rethinking many US policies, and creates sort of in the back of that, maybe a shift in what we might accept or what we might be happy just to be able to settle on big issues. I mentioned the Democrats are off balance. That is absolutely true, but so too is much of Washington, D.C. And you've seen this with the orders to first firing people, closing USAID, very dramatic. The Wilson Center is in the office building that USAID is also in, here in the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center building. And we saw not only the lockout of USAID employees, but then the building took down the signs for USAID that were on the building's exterior, and then covered up all the logos very quickly inside. So the agency was effectively erased. Very much a shock and awe approach to a bureaucracy that some will say has been very entrenched and didn't want to make changes, had resisted perhaps Donald Trump's vision, his mandate as he saw it in his first term. But what that means is that there's almost a muting of opposition or pushback. People are feeling overwhelmed. And if you have any business with the US government, you'll often find your interlocutors are themselves quite off balance, uncomfortable. Now, Congress is ultimately the most effective brake. Maybe some would say the Supreme Court, but Congress is most effective brake on a Trump administration, because the Congress has control over trade policy if it wants to assert it. It has control over a number of US U.S. initiatives and it has control of the purse strings. And what we'll see this year are two very big bills, one which we're already debating, which is the budget. Some of you will have noticed the U.S. spent the entire last 12 months in continuing resolutions, and we have one that expires on March 14th. That's not a great way to run a railroad, not great for fiscal probity, et cetera. The budget is the first thing that needs to be resolved by March 14th, because that is the day on which the most recent continuing resolution expires. And you've already seen both the House and Senate working on slightly different versions of the bill, hoping that they can move towards a reconciliation, which avoids the need for 60 votes in the Senate to get something through. Secondarily, we'll be talking about the 2017 tax cuts. These were a big shift in U.S. tax policy. They included the state and local tax deduction and some other measures that Donald Trump has said he wants to renew as part of his strategy for promoting U.S. growth. That's going to be tricky too, because although he says that he'll raise tariff revenue to offset some of the new spending while still allowing the tax cuts, and he hopes that economic growth will also help ease that transition. Anybody who's looked at this seriously has concluded that all of those things don't work together to get you growth, and certainly the additional spending that comes and the risk to the economy that comes from tariffs are really a very volatile combination, and not at all the kind of thing we would predict to create the outcome that Donald Trump wants. So that has led a lot of people to sort of second guess how serious is he about various tariffs, including the ones that are planned for Canada next week. One thing, though, to know about Congress, that in the House, especially, in the Senate to a lesser degree, that Republican majorities are very thin. And what that means is most legislation will require some centrists from the Democratic side to come over. And as we've seen on some of the nominations the president's put forward for cabinet positions, there are one or two Republicans. We think about Susan Collins in Maine, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, who may choose not to vote with Republicans, which puts a burden to find that many more Democrats to get things through. The good news for Republicans is they are nominally in control, and that's a positive. The bad news is because their control is so limited, they will struggle to get things done, and they'll get all the blame if things don't get done. And that is politically quite a tough position that may not be apparent from the outside, but is absolutely on the minds of our congressional leadership. Next slide there. So I mentioned earlier that this is sort of the mindset here, and I'm constantly briefing Canadians who are coming down. We have a regular flood of visitors right now, not just from Canada, but from other countries. And I always start with a little sense of the temper of our times. First, the establishment has the blues. I spent this weekend, my wife's a federal civil servant, and we were worried about the memo that Elon Musk demanded with 5 things you did last week. A lot of you in the corporate sector know that productivity management is something you can do subtly with software. This was not subtle, and it put a lot of people on the defensive. There have been firings that had to be rescinded, causing a certain amount of chaos in the government, including people in the energy department necessary for managing nuclear plants, some people at the FDA who were essential for implementing part of the first Trump administration's agenda. This is all part of what I think many of you will recognize in the private sector as being that move quickly and break things attitude, with the assumption that there will be lawsuits following, that some of this stuff will get pulled back. But the message I think that sends is twofold. One is the Trump administration is serious about shaking things up and is going to make a big effort to change things as much as it possibly can. And at the same time, the establishment shouldn't try to push back. In fact, they're going to spend all of their energy just trying to defend their jobs, their livelihood, and employment. And we think about civil servants, but remember that Washington is full of contractors, researchers, people who work at NGOs that receive funding from one or another federal agency. It's really quite remarkable how much everyone in Washington is connected in some way to taxpayer dollars. And so when you freeze all grants, even if it's only for a limited amount of time, a lot of people suddenly start panicking. How are they going to make rent payments or mortgage payments? What's going to happen, with summer vacation plans and so forth? Secondly, in the US overall, the early polling is a bit mixed. On the one hand, there's cautious optimism about the economy, particularly outside the Beltway, but also a sort of muted panic from critics of Donald Trump that this time he's serious, that maybe in the first term you could sort of laugh him off a bit. He didn't have the discipline, message discipline especially, to follow through on some of his ideas. I think the idea that this time is serious and the president intends to use his powers to the fullest has got a lot of people very nervous that they could be on the Trump list, even as some of the Trump voters out there right now remain cautiously optimistic that this is a turnaround that will lead to fewer US wars abroad, to less spending on the establishment and more benefits, including a reworking of globalization to benefit themselves. Now, in Canada, not surprisingly, and many of you will have seen this in your own families and circles, Trump's America First approach, just as it did in the first term, inspires nationalism abroad. And that nationalism is a perfectly natural reaction. It's been said before, not original to me, but the one philosophy that has successfully pushed back on globalization over time, perhaps the most successful, is not Islamic fundamentalism or anything else, it's nationalism. And so Canada's seen a spike in nationalism. We've seen booing at hockey games and other sort of popular expressions of frustration with the United States and the state of the US relationship now. But there's another important undertow here, which is an element of risk that I want to draw your attention to, and that's the return of anti-Americanism. I work with a number of people who are under 30 in my various research shops. If you're under 30, you don't remember anti-Americanism in the way that those of us who are over 30, in my case by quite a bit, will remember. This was the dominant sort of state of Canada when I was growing up. Still a friendly country, but initially skeptical to US proposals almost by default, viewing US maneuvers, even positive gestures or proposals, with a great deal of cynicism and suspicion that the US was up to no good, and also really a kind of pushback against American culture, dislike maybe of American brands, desire to buy local, etc. All of that is a volatile mix, and that will make it more difficult for whoever wins the Liberal leadership, and then in the next election, whoever becomes prime minister, to do too much with Canada. The return of anti-Americanism is not likely to be fleeting because it's so baked in the Canadian cake, but now it's being introduced to millennials and Generation Z, the largest voting bloc in both our countries. And I think the impact of that, it remains to be seen, but I think it's going to be, I'm not quite sure I agree with the Globe and Mail that it's the end of free trade as an era, but I do think it is the end of a particularly remarkable period from Canada-US free trade until 2025, when Canadians had taken the leap of faith, the roll of the dice that Mulroney asked them to take, embraced free trade with the US, and the belief that the US was a country that would abide by rules that we made together. And everyone knows on this call, I'm sure, that we didn't always. Things like softwood lumber slipped through. There were various breaches of that confidence, but never like this before. And I think it'll be hard to convince Canadians that the US has changed, certainly in this next 3 years till we get to 2028, perhaps beyond. Also, all the uncertainty about whether we will have a tariff or not is got to be great for Donald Trump's ratings. But on the other hand, it is very bad for business. You don't know whether you should invest now. You don't know whether you're going to see a growth economy. You don't know whether your supply chain is going to have to be reworked quite dramatically. So this is a corrosive erosion of confidence that will have an economic impact and lead to a certain amount of caution in the near term. Figuring out how long that will remain will depend on how we respond to some of these big challenges. So let me talk about two things that I think are dominating Donald Trump in terms of, I guess, an attempt to answer the question, what does he want ultimately? We know what he's saying, but what does he want to achieve? The first, which is fairly clear, and you'll have seen it, is winning great power competition, having the US remain on top. That is, it involves a reset with China and Russia. You will not have missed that he offered a much lower tariff, to only 10% to China, and while he was offering 2% to both 25% to both Canada and Mexico. With Russia, he's offering a kind of let's settle this Ukraine war with some dignity for Russia, and but stop the conflict and freeze it in a way that does disadvantage Ukraine. We'll see how the deal works out. But those are two very big overtures to two very big allies. He also wants to reset globalization. reciprocal tariffs. That is an idea that goes back before the WTO, before the GATT. I think it's an important thing to remember that after World War II, the US proposed very specifically kind of export-led growth model for the global South that could replace import substitution and industrialization, which many countries then practiced. But Donald Trump's vision doesn't offer export-led growth, at least not exporting to the US economy. It offers a more level playing field with reciprocal tariffs. But a level playing field when you are a less developed country is actually locking in a disadvantage rather than locking in an advantage. So he would like to reset globalization so it works for blue collar workers in the United States. There's certainly some support for that here in the US, bringing jobs home, etc. But it isn't without losers, and it will not be without some sort of blowback. And the risk of putting those two things together is that by resetting globalization in ways that abandons traditional market allies, economic allies, even if not military allies, he's creating an opening for China and perhaps other countries to step in and become more involved in the absence of a US pushback. Finally, and very important from a Canadian perspective, the president is very focused on energy dominance, and you've seen him invoke the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977, something designed to respond initially to the second of the Arab oil embargoes, the OPEC oil shock. So he's quite serious about energy dominance, not only in the US, but also globally. And Canada, I believe, is an important part of that equation. Or if it's frozen out of that equation, Canada will have an opportunity to compete with the United States and become a more reliable supplier in other markets. A big opportunity, but worth revisiting. Second, among Donald Trump's top two wish list is to put America first across the board in US policy. That includes a focus on blue collar jobs. Many of you will have noticed the blue collar worker was the soccer mom of the last election cycle. Both Republicans and Democrats hotly courted that group. It is a more diverse group. We often think of blue collar workers as being sort of white working class, but it includes a lot of African Americans, Hispanics, and Donald Trump did very well to be able to get that far. So blue collar jobs is a big priority. He's also brought American nationalism to the fore and has emphasized national security, which is, I think, an important takeaway to the extent that we think about things that fall in the middle of American politics. I mentioned earlier that Congress is going to be very tightly balanced. The kind of things that will pass the Congress are those things that have a national security element, because that's one area where both Republicans and Democrats are likely to agree, at least in the center. And you see resets on Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, and Iran, all very important allies, very important policy challenges for us. So I wanted to add on this some things to watch. U.S. debt. The U.S. debt is remarkably high. The president hopes to slow the growth of the deficit by finding offsets. I think you'll see the U.S. selling a lot of property. The General Services Administration maintains selling property, maybe with an old federal office building that has to be taken down, looking at selling other real estate in order to generate some revenue. Deficits are going to be a problem. And ironically, Donald Trump is very committed to a strong dollar. And the irony of that is a strong dollar will actually make it harder for the US to export abroad, which puts more pressure on imports. People have often interpreted his tariff threats as about protecting a domestic industry. But actually, in part, I think it's meant to try to create an environment in which a strong dollar US manufacturing base can still export. Very tricky to do, but worth considering. I'm going to breeze through this. Trump's tariff turmoil is well known to you. We have the ongoing softwood lumber dispute that never seems to go away. We have the threat of 20% tariffs on all imports from Canada. We'll see next week if those are imposed or if we wait until we get into April for that. 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Interestingly, not like last time. Last time we used the 1962 Trade Expansion Act to invoke national security tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Two things here. One, these tariffs are not using the 1962 Act, so we're not imposing them for national security reasons, which means you get the injury but without the insult. Nice improvement. But secondly, they apply to everyone. And so as a result, Canada will see less shift to other suppliers of steel and aluminum, which is relatively good. I think from a Canadian point of view, you're likely to hold on to more of that market share as a result. I believe the USMCA review will be moved forward and will be the appropriate place to talk about any imbalances in our trading relationships and injustices that Trump has in mind, partly because you have a comprehensive negotiation, so trade-offs are easier, but also because the USMCA review will tamp down the uncertainty facing Canada and Mexico and even the US in our highly integrated supply chains. Note here, bans on semiconductors, other things we've seen before, reciprocal tariffs, starting to see that roll out. And of course, remember the WTO, often the backstop, we still have a stalemate on the appellate court process, which I don't expect to change. Now, this is the big picture for you. And the thing I think I might just end on it because I know I'm trying to finish here by 11:30. I'm noting behind the scenes, the GRI keeps me on a very tight watch. So Trump timing. The thing to remember here is that typically the first 18 months of an administration are the most productive because they come prior to midterm elections. I'm being generous here in scoring 18 to 24 months, but the midterm elections will be a referendum on those first 2 years of the Trump administration. And as of now, while some people are cautiously optimistic about the turmoil, when some of the economic consequences come through, this could be a very competitive election, an opportunity for the Democrats to take perhaps the Senate, but certainly in the House where the margins are very, very narrow, could easily see them taking the House as well. No guarantee on that, but that potential will mean that the second 2 years of this term will be more difficult, probably. Not certainly, but probably. So the president came quick out of the gate and is trying to use these early months as best he can. After the midterms, you'll start to see a war of succession within the Republican Party. I know there are people who think Donald Trump will, reject the Constitution and run again. I think it's unlikely. He not only beat Joe Biden in the last election, he also won for himself the title of the oldest man ever to be sworn in for a 4-year term at 78, his age when we had our inauguration. I know people can live a long time now, but at the pace he lives his life, I'm a bit skeptical. I think that's why he picked J.D. Vance and has around him a number of Republicans who are more in line with him who might make a run for the presidency. We'll also start seeing the Democrats maneuvering to try to bring a message to 2028 that will stop the madness and give America a more normal policy. We'll see if that works. Growth now, high priority for the government because that will help them in those. I mentioned the budget, I mentioned the tax extension, I mentioned the US deficit, and last I mentioned that national security is a bipartisan priority. We'll see a lot in that area, including an increase in defense. 2025, I think this is sort of a quick timeline for those of you who like to clip and post this on your wall. USMCA review likely in 2025, very possibly the beginning of an annual review process for USMCA. If you're curious, I can talk to you about how that might work. 2026, we'll have US midterms, and all three of our countries end up hosting the FIFA World Cup. Huge event, great chance to wrap yourself in the flag, and ironically, something that we're talking a lot about in Washington now, much as the Ford administration following the Nixon administration embraced the bicentennial, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary in 2026 of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. That will be an opportunity for plenty of flag waving and excitement alongside the U.S. midterm election. In 2027, the U.S. is hosting the G7. We'll have a new Congress and the start of the presidential race, at least unofficially. In 2028, Summer Olympics. That'll be a big patriotic festival for the Americans, of course, and we hope Canadian teams do very well. It's summer, so I know that's not your strong suit. Political change, new generation, and that's where I want to kind of focus you in a slightly positive way. Look forward to the next generation. The people who will run Washington for Republicans and Democrats after Donald Trump are already here. And there's an opportunity to see them before they become so important that they're difficult to truly meet with. With that, let me stop, take questions and answers, and I'll turn the chair back to Jason, is the man with the plan.
Chris, many thanks. We now move to the Q&A component of today's event, starting with a reminder to please direct any questions to all panelists in the chat. For our first question, looking at Canada's overall approach to the Trump administration, and specifically on trade, how would you assess Canada's retaliatory strategy for U.S. trade threats generally, including American reciprocal tariffs, and proposed U.S. steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber tariffs specifically?
I think that there is a degree to which Donald Trump's talk about tariffs is a way of messaging to his base that he is going to put America first, no exceptions, not even Canada. And that message does resonate with his base. I think that's one of the reasons that despite all the uncertainty around those threats, he's been able to retain a fairly optimistic voter base. I think Canada has learned something from the first Trump term, which is that it also needs a retaliatory list in order that Canadians know that the government of Canada is going to stand up for Canadians. More in sorrow, perhaps, than anger, but Canada will not take this lying down. I think that's messaging. I think that's really important for the Trudeau government, particularly after Justin Trudeau went down and, in a sort of gesture of preemptive surrender, offered concessions on border before President Trump was even in office. He was happy to pocket them, would maybe ask for more as soon as there's a new prime minister. A bit unfortunate the timing of that, but these kind of big picture communications, as long as they stay that way, are a kind of mutual assured destruction strategy. Like as long as we don't wipe each other out or wipe our economies out, that'll be fine. But if we were to act on either of those, the U.S. putting 25% tariff across the board on top of potential steel and aluminum tariffs of 25%, and Canada begins retaliating, you will see the U.S. and Canadian economies damaged quite quickly and quite dramatically. Some people will defer consumption. Other people will choose to not engage in economic activity, prefer to save. I think one of the other things you'll see is in price sensitive markets where you cannot pass a tariff on to the consumer really and stay competitive, particularly if Chinese imports are your competition and those Chinese imports are only paying a 10% penalty. In that environment, any company that wants to survive is going to have to look to cut costs someplace. And one way to do that, lay people off. And that may be a temporary layoff facing the conditions and anticipating slower production and maybe not needing people, but it'll have an immediate and very negative effect on the economy. Now, specifically on some of these items, as long as there's signals, I think we can manage them. Softwood lumber is a special case. It's always been outside all of our trade agreements. The U.S. is not as competitive. We don't have the factor endowment in forests and good trees that Canada does. I'm afraid that there's not a lot to trade with, but if I were talking to U.S. trade negotiators, I'd point them to New Brunswick. In the last round, New Brunswick was willing to change to a more auction-oriented model with the support of the Irvings, which is very important out there. And yet the U.S. didn't exempt New Brunswick from subsequent tariffs. I think what message that sent was that even if you do the right thing as a Canadian province, there's no way to get away from U.S. across-the-board tariffs, which was a strategic mistake on our part. I think it will drive Canada to take a harder line and try to maintain Canada's export tax, which you see that a little bit in Canada's retaliatory strategy. Well, what if we tax our goods before they get to the United States? Then you don't have to put tariff on us, and we keep the money and we can use that to help invest in productivity improvements at home. Not a bad strategy. And I don't see anything in Donald Trump and his rhetoric that would prevent that from working, particularly in a targeted area. And remember, aluminum and steel, fascinating sectors. So much of Canadian aluminum and steel is very specific to customers. And so, GM, Ford, others buying sort of specialty steel for their commodities. It's not easy to find a secondary market for that steel, nor easy for those automakers to find another manufacturer as quick and easy as the one already in their supply chains. So I think those tariffs run the risk of creating a kind of problem for U.S. industry across the board. And I've watched autos for a long time, and while they may get bruised and beat up and near bankrupt, they always get bailed out. They almost always prevail because they're so good at leveraging employment and getting Washington to take notice. So I'm kind of rooting for cars, and not just because I'm from Detroit.
Excellent. For our next question, what's your view of Canada's policy responses on fentanyl, immigration, and military spending to date, both in their own right and in the context of addressing American tariff threats?
Oh, excellent question. I have to say, I quote Bruce Heyman, the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, who observed that of the two countries, forget what you know about hockey and baseball. The true national sports for the Americans is litigation, and the true national sport of Canada is negotiation. And I think those two mindsets affect the way in which we are playing out this particular conflict. The United States tends to bang on the table and said, you committed to 2%, goddammit, where's your 2% spending on defense? Canada, on the other hand, says, oh yes, we're also concerned about fentanyl. We're also concerned about immigration. We'll make you an offer. What can we get in return? And Canada's just an opening gambit. It's putting some money on the table. Can Canada afford to do more than 1.3 billion on defense and counter narcotics? Yes, it can, especially when you see that number is spread over 6 years. But what it does is it encourages the US to come to the table and say, well, that's not good enough. I want 2.6 billion. And Canada says, well, we could do 2.6 million, but maybe you could do this for us. It's just a very natural Canadian response. The Trump administration is still in that litigation mindset. And so I think while there is sort of a mixed message there, or sort of two approaches that are going to grind a bit, if we can get into a larger negotiation framework, Canada's brilliant at that, and the US fundamentally doesn't want to hurt its own position. Where we have to get away from is Donald Trump running everything off of his own desk because he thinks this way. He's always thought about suing people. It's just the way he does business, and we need to pull away from that. Now, one positive note on that: the president early on picked a remarkable former member of Congress as his nominee for ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra from West Michigan, part of the West Michigan Dutch, very conservative group. He was a Tea Partier. It's a long story. I'll tell it to anybody over a beer. Just ask me. But he essentially saved the Republican Party and delivered Michigan for the president in this last election. And when the president asked him what he wanted in return, he wanted to be ambassador to Canada. Watch that space. He's a smart guy. He's been an ambassador before. He was Trump's first ambassador to the Netherlands. But he's also someone who has the wherewithal to stand up to Donald Trump, but also is someone that Canadians can talk to who is not Donald Trump. And I think he'll mitigate a lot of the complex issues that come with some of these threats. Also, Jameson Greer, Howard Lutnick, some of the other key economic policymakers who I think will have an influence. I should add Doug Burgum because he's going to be the energy czar coordinating government policy. As those people come in and take their jobs and start moving in, it's less important for Donald Trump to micromanage. And I think those are individuals who will want to run with the ball a little bit on their own. That's a good sign for Canada as well.
Thank you. For our next question from the audience, why does there seem to be such a strong consensus in Canada around the use of retaliatory tariffs? And do you agree that Canada should hit back?
Yes, I do. Well, I agree that Canada has to take this position. And the reason I say that is that I don't know how to. There are a lot of Americans who worry that we are no longer dealing with Canada that can do, but instead that we're dealing with a Canada that can't. And I say that because it's a long sort of concern that we always thought Canada just wouldn't say yes on defense spending, on infrastructure, on whatever was on our list. And so we negotiated with Canada to try to get Canada to do the things we wanted to do. But this creeping sense that Canada is a cannot do country, that we can yell all we want, Canada couldn't deliver if we wanted them to. That concern is terrible for the bilateral relationship. And it leads people, and I will say a lot of American policymakers who deal with Canada are used to dealing with Latin America, to sort of cheapen Canadian sovereignty, see Canada less as a peer and more as a sort of subject or dependent. That's profoundly disrespectful. And that's fueling nationalism. But I think what Donald Trump said in his first term when he was asked about being an America First president, he said, "Of course I'm America first, and I expect Xi Jinping puts China first. I expect, Vladimir Putin puts Russia first. Every leader should put their own people first." And that's how he sees the world. So a Canada that sort of responds to him by saying, "Oh well, please don't hit us with tariffs. We'll give you whatever you want," is not going to win his respect. But a Canada that says, "You can play this game, and we're both going to lose, but we're willing to go if that's what you want." I often think a little bit of our friends in Mexico. There's that phrase from the cowboy movies of the past, the Mexican standoff, where the Mexican is cornered or the bandito is cornered, and he says, "Well, I may go down, but I'm taking you with me." That's not a bad approach to somebody like Donald Trump. Yeah, it's unlikely he'll pull the whole U.S. down, but standing up for yourself, pushing back, and saying, there's nothing wrong with being Canadians. We can do what we say we're going to do, and we will do it, but we're not going to be bullied and insulted, is not a bad stance. I don't think it will hurt you with him at all.
Picking up on that good point and argument, Chris, there seems to be a pretty strong likelihood that Europe is about to do this fairly soon as well. And in this context, as a so-called middle power, Canada could have formal or informal allies on this because the US estimates of tariffs are always assuming one and done without major retaliation and an escalating trade war. Any comments on that?
Yes, I think the Europeans, like the Canadians, are in this category for the Trump administration of countries that can do more, but have always opted not to do more. And J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference was, I think, meant to be interpreted as it was, that the US was not going to be there for Europe. Europe had to defend itself because Russia wasn't threat number one, China was, and the US was turning its attention elsewhere. Shocking, absolutely. And Canada's in a better position because it is hard to defend the US without defending Canada as well. But the Europeans need to step up, and governments of all stripes in Europe have generally not wanted to, because it's always better to spend social spending, etc. And now they're realizing they have no choice. So their stepping forward is significant. The idea that they could be partners with Canada, both economically, you already have the seat in place, so the vehicle is there. I would add Britain to that mix because Britain's both an important defense ally outside the European Union, but like Canada, alienated from the bloc next door, which is its big market that it traditionally relies on. There's some common cause between Britain and Canada, which I think is important. And then you look at Asia. Japan, a natural partner for Canada. They desperately want Canadian energy to stop buying LNG from the Russians, for Christ's sake. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but still. So there's a lot. Canada will have a lot of friends abroad. And I'd underscore one other thing, which is that the US under Donald Trump, and to some extent under Biden, has been shifting defense policy away from the capability of winning small wars, particularly in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, to an emphasis on deterrence of China, arming up and basically intimidating China from taking a move against Taiwan or taking a move against the US. That's a very popular defense policy in the US. And I did a couple talks in Canada during the election, and I would talk to student audiences and remind them that what makes a college student audience in Canada different from a college student audience in the US is that in the US, almost everybody in their young 20s knows somebody in their town who was a veteran of one of those wars that came back injured, or somebody maybe in their friendship circle who died in the war. There were large numbers of Americans who were affected, and that was very visible on a lot of American streets, not something Canada had at the same level of urgency. So for me, that's kind of an important distinction. And the US playing a deterrence strategy means that we have to pick our battles very carefully. But it opens up a lot of room for secondary powers to pick up issues like climate change, to pick up issues like maybe a secondary conflict like supporting the Finns, or figuring out how to help the Greenlanders defend their territory so that Donald Trump doesn't try to buy them, or even stepping in and trying to help countries in Africa or in Asia with things that formerly USAID or another US philanthropic organization might have financed on their own. Canada has huge freedom of movement here that will not put you in any jeopardy with the US. And whether that's economic, humanitarian, or even in terms of security and defense, in each of those areas, I think there's a lot of room for Canada to grow if it wants to seize this moment.
Picking up on that very good point, another question for the audience is in the context of this being a pivotal moment for Canada. Could this be looked at as a permanent shift towards the European Union, other international partners, and without calling it the third option, getting into something that's sustainable diversification?
Yes. And if we go back to an earlier era, early on after the American Revolution, Canada adopted, I think, one of its more shrewd global economic strategies, which was because of the tie to Great Britain. Britain brought in a lot of premium products, was definitely a partner of choice. But unlike other parts of the British Empire, Canada maintained a steady trade, mostly in natural resources, with the United States to make sure they didn't have to sell lumber and other products to Britain at discount prices and really pay the sort of negative price of mercantilist economic policy from the UK. That put Canada in a unique position. And it's one of the reasons Canada grew so quickly ahead of other parts of the British Empire. So if we take that as a sort of analogous situation, Canada might find itself dealing with both the European Union and the United States, with maybe one market rising, one market falling, but the ability to play in both of those giving Canada the ability to have the best of both worlds and preventing either one from having enough sway that it could really break Canada down. Canada's GDP is, I think, 70% generated by exports. And so there will be, for sure, some need to find new markets. For commodities, that's the easiest. Commodities are fungible, and if the US is putting tariffs on them, then you can find lots of markets that will take up your commodities. A little trickier, though, are the intermediate goods that a lot of manufacturing in Ontario and Quebec sort of thrive on. Those intermediate goods are intermediate because they go into somebody else's widget, and it takes a little time to retool. Some of them are not as easy to sell in other markets. And so I think, particularly in central Canada, there will be a period of adjustment. And Europe provides some of the only other supply chains at that level of sophistication that the US has outside of China. And you could go to China, but China doesn't need those inputs, and it has its own sort of political economy thing going. So I think in that sense, Europe is a natural partner. And we'll see. I think that Justin Trudeau had kind of worn out his welcome with some of the European leaders. The next prime minister might have more success, particularly if he's somebody who spent a lot of time in the UK. Not that I'm thinking about.
Picking up on your earlier comment, one of the questions from the audience is around the USMCA. And you had talked about accelerating the timing of that negotiation. A number of people favor that approach, but critics also say, what evidence is there that Donald Trump respects agreements? What evidence is there that we're not into the equivalent of Groundhog Day movie, where this is a perpetual negotiation? If you can outline your view of why we should start the negotiation early, and is this an effective outcome?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that the value for Canada in a USMCA renegotiation, because fairly clear that that's where Donald Trump would like to be, is that it takes all of these debates and puts them into a framework where new change is only going to happen after negotiation and a ratification. So that just gives you time. And if we go back to the time sort of frame, we have from now until midterms in November of 2026. That is a very finite period. If we accelerate the negotiation, take some of the daily threats against the Canadian economy, set them to one side, create a more predictable space in which there can be winners and losers. Remember that the first Trump term, there was Donald Trump throwing off threats from above, but there was also Robert Lighthizer, who, say what you like about him, is a professional, knows what he's doing, very smart guy, hard bargainer, but that's the way trade negotiators are, so not a shock. Jameson Greer, his protege, I think will be very similar. So you won't get an easy ride, but at least then you're talking. And the value of a multi-issue negotiation is you might have to give up on dairy, but you can gain someplace else. Softwood lumber, on the other hand, it's just softwood versus softwood. There are only so many levers you can pull to get a good outcome. But in a comprehensive negotiation, you can get much more. I'll suggest something I think could be important in this context, and that is adding national security, particularly border security commitments into the USMCA. Jason, you'll remember that when we were talking about Canada-US free trade, the trade community said, we're not going to put environment, labor provisions here. They don't belong as a trade agreement. You guys are just trying to hitchhike on our agreement, go pound sand. With NAFTA, that was the same approach that our negotiators took, but Bill Clinton said, if I'm going to pass this with some Democratic votes, I'm going to have labor and environment side agreements. Okay, that started introducing the idea. We've subsequently, both of us, put labor and environment in the mainstream of trade agreements, and it's in the USMCA. But we've also been negotiating in tandem to our trade agreements, our border security. From 9/11 forward, we've had ongoing discussions of security prosperity partnership, beyond the border working group, et cetera. So we have a sort of built-in agenda. Could we agree that, for example, Canada will inspect for US intellectual property when goods land first at Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Halifax, or Montreal? Of course we could. Maybe there's a trade-off for that, but that's a reasonable requirement. Could we agree that all three countries will step up efforts to try to find narcotics and human trafficking in those supply chains and do extra inspections? Sure, we could. And maybe that involves coordinating equipment so that, say, at a border crossing, one side of the border, the other has the equipment that's necessary to do the inspections. But those are tangible things. That's a set of trade-offs that are very easy to do. Well, not easy to do, but easy to understand how that could come together. So
Yes.
for me, engaging early is a really good idea, but I want to address something I threw out there. Donald Trump and some of the people around him have talked about the value of an annual review of the USMCA. that's a real mixed blessing. I think it's like for Canada anyway, because of the importance of this relationship, it's like having an annual review of being married. If you had to get married every year, it would be very tough after a while to say, do you still want to do this? Whereas I guess renewal of vows is a little bit less significant as long as you don't have to do it very much. But the idea of tweaking the rules from time to time is not a terrible one. I just, if we can get to 2028 and we can have an election, a younger generation coming into the US, in Canada, I think we can reset the relationship then, which is really important. But right now, we need to keep talking, take more things away from Donald Trump himself, get Canada out of the daily headlines, and put Canada into a structured, predictable negotiating process that gives everyone enough calm that we can proceed. I know that sounds like a fantasy, but I'm a dreamer.
Well, we have, of course, numerous questions that unfortunately won't have a chance to get to, but a number have asked about the merits of the three-way negotiation with Mexico as compared to bilateral. Your comments on that, particularly in the context of with us being roughly 40 million, Mexico being 140 million versus the US population.
So a couple of things there, and I have to give the Mexicans credit. Claudia Sheinbaum came out of the gate pushing back against Donald Trump, but very quietly using Trump's sort of threats to get some things done with the Mexican cartels. She essentially said, you know, Donald Trump is going to blow up your fentanyl lab with a missile or a drone, and I can't stop him. Do you want to negotiate with me, or you want to negotiate with him? Because that's the options. Now, they're tough guys, but I think they see the logic, and she's trying to get enough control that she can avoid having Trump come at her. Canada doing something similar, which is, you know, we have these interprovincial trade barriers that have been bedeviling us for years. It's time to kind of crack some heads because otherwise Donald Trump's going to have our lunch. I don't support Donald Trump bullying everyone, but on the other hand, if you can use that to do something that's good domestically, why not? I think that's very positive. Canada and Mexico are different. They're very different, obviously, between the two. I think we have some room for variable geometry, as the Europeans would call it, with things moving perhaps at two speeds. There are discussions on national security we will have with Canada, border security, cyber security, security in the Arctic, that Mexico cannot play in that at all. There's just no hope. But might be good for them to watch from the sidelines, but they're just not ready. And Canada and Mexico has so many fundamental problems of extreme underdevelopment, and this might not have kind of resonated with Canadians, but we have begun mass deportations, so-called repatriations, of Central Americans, Mexicans, Venezuelans out. Some of the Venezuelans are being sent to Guantanamo because we have space to keep them. But these very dramatic moves are putting so much pressure on the Latin American countries. I think a Canada that is at least willing to treat Mexico as a friend and partner, maybe suffering along with Mexico some of the threats from Donald Trump and work with them, would make a big difference. People appreciate when you help them when they're down, right? And they know, Mexico's under a lot of pressure. Mexico knows you're under a lot of pressure. Unlike Doug Ford and his threats to kind of kick Mexico out of the USMCA, that sort of thing, I think we should be positive and look for strategic areas of collaboration between Canada and Mexico. I think the World Cup of Soccer provides a sort of feel-good opportunity to do that. But I have another idea for the next Prime Minister. Just if you could all pass this on for me, and that is, I think Canada's going to host the G7 in June. I know Canada's going to host the G7 June in Kananaskis, the 15th through the 17th. Why not invite Mexico? Because Canada is overdue to hold a North American Leaders Summit. Canada should have been hosted in 23, 24, 25, but just invite Sheinbaum up and have a little sidebar with Donald Trump and talk about starting the USMCA negotiations. I mean, you don't have much to lose. It's better to have the Mexican than Vladimir Putin coming, which I think is Trump's idea. So, maybe a little leadership in that area, build some goodwill. I think Mexico obviously has problems, but at the same time, I think there's some value in reaching out to them.
Thank you. For the next two questions, given that we're approaching the end, if we can keep responses to 2 minutes, I'd love to give you 5 to 10. But first is on the Democrats. Is there reason to believe that the Democrats can come back here, whether it's coming up with something other than traditional candidates, given the success of Trump, Vance, and their style?
Yeah, I think they can. There are too many oldsters still running the Democratic Party, but Hakeem Jeffries is a younger voice. Chuck Schumer's getting up there in years, but you look at some of the governors because that's often a sort of prep space. Someone like Wes Moore, the African American governor of Maryland, my state now, is very impressive. We've seen a few other governors and even big city mayors who have some appeal. So yeah, the Democrats will. The beauty of two-party system is that everybody needs to survive, and they will morph to get the votes they need to win next time. So I think take time, but they'll come back swinging.
Thank you. And for our final question, right now with Canada's Parliament prorogued, the Liberal leadership campaign underway until the 9th of March, and federal election highly likely this spring. What should Canada's approach be given the imminent imposition of tariffs and other U.S. America First policies here between now and when we have a newly publicly elected PM?
Where I think we need to be is a world in which we do a better job of working with the data we have to tell the story of how trade affects people. We've been saying that since NAFTA, if not before. We have just published a piece at the Wilson Center by Jim Haley, a former Canadian executive director at the IMF, a longtime Canadian policymaker. He used AI to assess Canada's retaliatory tariff strategy. And what he did was looked at how it affected red states and particular members of Congress. And he found that the strategy was highly targeted and focused. That's the offense side. On the defense side, ever since USMCA and a little bit before, we've been using electronic bills of lading. So we have data that's mineable. The USMCA even says, with personal identifying characteristics sometimes removed, we should mine publicly collected data. Electronic bills of lading mean we know the value, the HS code, and the zip code of where everything goes. We need to break that sense that US data says trade occurs at the border where it's first recorded and give people a more comprehensive picture of the way in which our economy now works. And that I think many people, including many Trump voters, would be surprised. But remember, if they're millennials or Generation Z, they're going to be much more comfortable with the data and with the technology that it takes to run it than, say, somebody of Donald Trump's vintage. So that's the future. And if I were Canada, building on Team Canada One, that tremendous outreach with data to Americans, getting more Americans to engage in the data and realize just how globalization's affected us. And as you said at the outset, Jason, how North American competitiveness really does come from our connectivity and all the barriers we've been able to remove between us. I think then we'll have a sustainable prosperity and path forward long after Donald Trump has stopped tweeting, if ever.
Chris, thank you very much for your comments and also the Q&A. Nez, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris and Jason. This was a great session, very insightful, and thank you for your time. I think we heard some great insights from Chris and Jason today from the rising anti-Americanism and nationalism sentiment among especially younger Canadians, and the fact that the Trump administration probably has a limited window to implement its robust America First policy until the next midterm election. And they are doing this in the middle of a high debt burden and the mixed sentiment of muted panic and cautious optimism, as you called out, Chris, among Americans. I think there's definitely going to be difficulty in navigating the current situation as long as US is in the mindset of litigation and Canada is coming from a place of more negotiation. And I think some key takeaways is it's definitely a difficult environment, and Canada will be well served to look for other trade partners, including Europe and Asia. So with that, I'd like to thank you one more time, Jason and Chris, and thank you for joining us today. And before we move on,